never taught her own age or birthday. A Lakota chief was the first to celebrate her existing. The fire had been low for an hour before she came to it. I remember the sound of her walking more than I remember first seeing her. Boots, not moccasins, not bare feet, and the scrape of one heel dragging a little, like she'd been on her feet since before the sun. I was sitting at the edge of our winter camp, the big one we kept near the river bend, and I had a pipe I wasn't smoking because I'd run out of things to think about, and I find a pipe in your hand gives other men the signal to leave you alone. She came out of the dark the way a person does when they've been walking a long time and stopped being careful about what's ahead. Not frightened, just spent. She was carrying a canvas bag on each shoulder and a third in her right hand, and she stopped when she saw the fire. She looked at it the way a man looks at water when he's been too long without. Not at me, at the fire. I said in English, "Sit down if you want to." She sat. She put the bags down and she held her hands out, and her fingers were so cold the knuckles had gone white even in the orange of the fire. She didn't say anything for a while. I didn't ask who she was or where she'd come from. That's not how we did things. You let a person breathe first. After some time she said, "I didn't mean to walk into your camp. I thought the river was on the other side of these trees." I told her it was half a mile east. She nodded. She looked at the bags on the ground beside her. She looked at the fire again. There was something in her face that I'd seen before, not grief exactly, but the close cousin of it, the look of a person who has made a choice they are no longer fully sure was right and is too tired to go back. I asked if she had food. She said she had biscuits. She pulled them from the canvas bag, 2 of them, hard as river stone, and she broke one in half and held the half toward me without looking up. I had eaten 2 hours before. I took the half biscuit. We sat there a while eating in the firelight, and I was thinking about how strange it was. A Lakota man past his prime with a pipe. He wasn't smoking, and a biscuit from a woman whose name I did not know, and the whole wide territory around us not making a sound. Her name was Clara Strand. She told me that after the 3rd piece of biscuit, when she'd eaten enough to feel something that resembled human again. She was a schoolteacher from a town I knew, a settlement 3 days east that was slowly dying the way those places do, the men leaving for silver and the women outlasting them or following or both. She'd been the only teacher for 4 years. She said it the way you'd say it if you'd been asked to hold a building up with your own 2 arms for 4 years. I told her my name. I told her what I was. I told her that my name in my own tongue would take too long to say in the dark, and that most people who needed to find me called me Walks Far, which is a bad translation but close enough. She said that's a real name, not like what they give us. I looked at her then. She was looking at the fire. She said I was thinking about names, and how some people get real ones. I didn't say anything. I waited. She said, "My mother called me girl and my father called me by my sister's name for so long I think he forgot there were 2 of us. Clara was what the county record said. I've been Clara because a piece of paper said so." I thought about that for a while. I said, "You know how old you are." She looked up at me then. I remember the way the fire moved on her face. She said, "I know approximately. There was never no one ever." She stopped. She said there was never any occasion for it, any year, anyone to say, "This is the day you came into the world and we are glad of it." I held that. I let it sit between us like the fire between us, something real and warm and needing tending. I was 53 years old that winter. I had been a chief for 11 years, and before that a warrior, and before that a boy who ran barefoot along the river, and before that nothing at all, just air and possibility. I had buried a wife 6 years before. I had a son who was grown and living east with a woman from the Cheyenne people. I had 200 and some people who looked to me to know things, and most days I did know things, and some days I held the not knowing the way you hold a coal that's nearly gone out, careful and hoping. I had not, in all that time, met a woman who had never once been told that her arriving in the world mattered. I said to her that night, "You should stay until you've slept." She looked at me and I could see her measuring something, whether I was safe, whether I meant what I said, whether she was desperate enough for warmth to find out. She was. I think on all counts she was. She slept in the big fire lodge, with the women and the old ones, wrapped in a blanket that Singing Elk pressed on her without asking. I went to my own place and I lay on my back and I stared at the lodge skin, and I thought about a woman who did not know her own birthday. I thought about what it would do to a person, year after year, to pass through the day they were born without anyone saying, "You here, we see you." I've said that to my people 100 times. We have ways of marking a person's arrival. Ways of saying, this specific person with this specific spirit came to us on this specific day, and the world is different because they are in it. We don't always do it grandly. Sometimes it's just a word, a hand on the shoulder, a particular song at the particular fire. But we do it. She didn't know what that was. 30-some years on this earth, she guessed at 32 or 33, and nobody had done that for her. In the morning she was up before most, and she was outside trying to repair something on her boot, the heel that dragged, working at it with a small blade she'd taken from her bag. She had quick hands. She had the focused look of a person who has had to fix things themselves for so long that it has become simply how the world works. I sat down beside her. I brought coffee, which we had a small amount of, and I gave her the first cup. She stopped working on the boot. She took the cup with both hands. She said, "Thank you, walks far." I liked hearing my name in her voice. It settled differently than I expected. I asked her where she was going. She said west. She said the school had closed when the last family left, and she'd stayed 2 months past the point she should have, trying to see if anyone was coming back, and they weren't. And she'd packed what she owned and was walking to the next town, which was west, and she'd miscalculated the distance or the pace or both. I said, "That's 3 more days walking." She said, "I know that now." I said we could bring her. We were moving camp in 4 days. It was that season, the shifting south season, and the path would take us within a day's walk of where she was going. She was quiet for a time. Then she said, "I don't want to be a trouble." I said, "You're not a trouble." She looked at me and I looked back. There was something in that look, a kind of recognition, the kind that doesn't come from knowing someone's history but from seeing how they hold themselves in the world, how they're made. I knew it when I felt it, and I let it be what it was, and I didn't look away. She said, "All right." Those 4 days were, I don't know how to say it right, strange and ordinary at once. She helped where she could. She was not a woman who sat still while others worked. She was small and she was strong in the compact way that comes from having done everything yourself for a long time. She figured out how we did things quickly, and she fit into the shape of the days without making a show of it. The children followed her at first from curiosity, then from something more like fondness. She had a way with children, not performing the friendly teacher, but genuinely interested in what they said to her, genuinely amused by what was funny, genuinely patient with the ones who weren't yet sure of her. Singing Elk, who was 60 years old and had no use for most people, told me on the second evening that the white schoolteacher was a good person. Coming from Singing Elk, that's like another person building you a house. I watched Clara. I know I watched her more than I should have. More than a man of my position ought to watch a woman he's known for 4 days. But there was something in her that pulled at something in me, and I have been honest with myself for long enough to know when something is just curiosity and when it is something else. I had not looked at a woman that way since my wife. Not once in 6 years. I had thought, somewhere in those 6 years, that maybe I had gotten past the age of it. That part of me that finds another person and recognizes them, I had thought maybe that was gone. It wasn't. It was just waiting. On the 3rd evening she sat near me at the fire, and she was mending a piece of cloth, and I was looking at the stars, and we were not talking, but the silence between us was the comfortable kind, the kind you have with someone you have known a long time or will. And she said, without looking up from the cloth, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. She said, "The things you know. The things your people know about time, about the year, about a person and when they came. Is that something you can teach?" I said, "What do you want to know?" She said, "I want to know how to." She stopped and started again. She said, "I want to know what the markers are. The ones that matter. I've been alive 30-some years and I have never once known which day was mine. Which one was the day the world started with me in it, and it didn't used to bother me. But lately." She stopped. I said, "Lately what?" She said quietly, "Lately I want someone to know when it is." I held that a long time. The fire popped. Somewhere behind us, one of the horses shifted in its sleep. I said, "We can find it." She looked at me then. I said, "Not the exact day, that's gone, we can't get it back, but we can find the season. If you know what the weather was when you were new, if you know what your mother told you about the time of year, anything. And if we find the season, we can pick a day. And that day can be the day." She said, "Can you just pick one?" I said, "It's your day. You can put it wherever you want it." She was very still for a moment. Then something moved in her face that I had not seen there before. Not quite crying. The thing that comes before it does, when something that has been held very tight for a very long time finally gets the chance to be put down. She said she thought it was probably late winter. She thought she remembered her mother saying once, only once, something about mud season. How there had been mud everywhere when she was born, and it had been, her mother said it with some distaste, inconvenient. I said, "Late winter, we can work with that." She said, "You're serious?" I said I was. She went quiet again. Then she said, "How would you do it?" I told her. I told her what we do when we want to mark a person's arrival on the earth. I told her it doesn't have to be large. It can be a fire and a song and a few people who mean it. It can be someone putting their hand on your shoulder and saying, "I know which day you came, and I am glad you are here." She listened to all of it, and when I was done she said, very softly, "I have never had that." I said, "I know." She said, "Nobody has ever." I said, "I know." There was a long quiet. Then she said, "Why are you being kind to me?" And I said, "Because you're worth being kind to." That's all I said. I didn't say it large. I said it the way you'd say, "The sky is going to clear by morning," a plain thing, a true thing. She looked at me for a long time in the firelight, and I looked back, and I didn't fill it with anything else, because it didn't need anything else. On the fourth day we broke camp and moved south and west. She walked near the front with me most of the morning, and we talked about 100 things. The land, the names of grasses, the names of stars, a book she had taught the children that she loved and one she hated, what I had been like as a young man, which made her laugh in a way that surprised her, like she'd forgotten laughing was something her face knew how to do. That laugh went into me, somewhere it could stay. In the early afternoon we came to the edge of a long flat plain, and I could see in the distance the smear of smoke that meant a settlement. She slowed when she saw it. I slowed with her. She said, "That's it." I said, "That's it, maybe 6 hours walking." She said, "I see." She didn't move. We both stood there looking at the smoke. I said, "Are you ready to go?" And she said, "I don't know that I am." I waited. She said, "I have been walking toward something my whole life and I've never been sure what. But these 4 days," she stopped. She looked at her boots. She said, "These 4 days I was somewhere I knew where I was." I said, "You can stay." She looked up at me fast, like she wasn't sure she'd heard it right. I said it again. I said, "You can stay. We can use a school teacher. The children already follow you. You'd have to learn the language, but you're quick and you'd have it in a year." She said, "Walks far." I said, "Clara." She said, "You are asking me to stay." I said, "I am." She was quiet for what felt like a long time. The wind moved the grass between us and the settlement. The smoke stood straight up from whatever they were burning. She said, "And what would I be if I stayed?" I told her she could be whatever she chose to be. That much I could not decide. But I told her, and I was careful. I was as careful as I had been about anything in years. I told her that I would like her to be near me. That I had spent 6 years not wanting anything for myself, and that feeling, the wanting, had come back when she walked out of the dark and sat down at my fire. I told her I was not a young man. That I had a son and I had buried a wife, and I had 200 people who needed things from me, and some days I was very tired. I told her all of it. I didn't hide the hard parts to make the asking easier. She listened to all of it with her hands quiet at her sides and her eyes on my face. When I was done, she said, "You are the first person who has ever told me the hard parts first." I said, "I'm too old for the other way." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Then she said, very still, very plain, "I want to stay. I want to stay, and I am frightened, but I have been frightened before and I am still here." And I said, "I know you are. I can see that about you plain as anything." She looked at the settlement once more. Then she turned her back to it. We walked back to camp as the sun went down behind us. I didn't touch her that day. I didn't need to. She walked beside me and her boot still dragged a little on the heel, and I thought, "I'll fix that tomorrow." The day we decided was hers. We set it 3 weeks out to let the late winter cold settle in proper, the way she thought it had been when she arrived. Singing Elk wanted to make it larger, and I let her, because Singing Elk's large was still smaller than most people's small, and because Clara had spent 30-some years without any of it, and I thought she deserved a little large. The morning of it, Clara didn't know what to do with herself. I could tell from breakfast on. She was too still and too careful, the way a person gets when they're trying not to want something too much in case it doesn't come. I left her alone until the afternoon. Then I came and found her sitting outside my lodge. She had her own, but she sat outside mine sometimes. I had started to notice this, the way you notice the direction a river bends, and I said, "Come." She said, "Where?" I said, "To your day." It was not large. It was a fire outside, a good one, and Singing Elk and 4 of the older women, and 2 of the men who had been with me the longest, and 7 of the children who insisted. Clara stood at the edge of the circle looking like she might tip over from the weight of it. I went and stood beside her. I put my hand on her shoulder. I could feel her shaking a little. I said in my own language first and then in English so she could hear it, "This woman came into the world on a day in late winter, and that day the world became different than it had been before. She is here. She is seen. We are glad of it." The children repeated the last part the way children do, in a jumble of words that were approximately right, and it made Clara put a hand to her mouth, and the other one went to my arm, her fingers around my forearm, and she held on. Singing Elk sang. It wasn't long. Singing Elk songs are never long. She says the short ones carry more because they don't waste the air. And it was an arriving song, a welcome song. And Clara didn't understand the words, but she understood it, and I could feel her grip on my arm tighten, and then slowly, slowly loosen, the way something does when it stops being afraid. When the song was done, I looked at her, and she was looking at the fire, and there were tears on her face, just 2 or 3, the kind a person doesn't notice until they're already there. She said very quietly to nobody and everybody, "I didn't know it would feel like this." I said, "What does it feel like?" She turned and looked at me. Her hand was still on my arm, and she let it stay, and I let it stay, and the fire was between us and the children and the old women and the dark sky above all of it, and she said, "Like I am somewhere, like I have finally arrived somewhere." I said, "You have." She put her forehead against my shoulder then. Just that, no grand gesture, just a head against a shoulder in the cold and the firelight. I put my arm around her, and she fit there the way things fit that were always going to. We stayed like that a while. The children lost interest and wandered. Singing Elk smoked her pipe and looked at us sideways and said nothing, which from Singing Elk is as good as a blessing. I have been seen 1,000 ways in my life. I have been seen as a chief, as a warrior, as a threat, as a problem, as a curiosity. I have been seen as a widower, as a leader, as a man past his time of being dangerous to anyone. I have been seen as a translation problem and as a useful intermediary and as an inconvenient holder of land. Nobody had seen me in a long time as what Clara looked at me as, standing in that firelight on the day we had made hers. She looked at me like I was a man, like I was a specific man, this one, this particular one, and that he mattered to her and she was choosing him and she was not confused about it. That's a thing, to be looked at like that. I don't have a word for what it does to you, and I have words for most things. Spring came and Clara learned the language faster than I'd told her she would. She had a teacher's ear. She heard the pattern in things and held it. By the time the grass was green, she could speak well enough to teach the older children and embarrass the younger men who'd been condescending to her in their own language thinking she couldn't hear. She also fixed her own boot. She didn't wait for me. I found her one morning with the boot on a stone and a piece of leather, and in all she'd gotten from somewhere, working at it with that same focused look she'd had that first morning. I watched her for a while. When she was done, she put the boot back on and walked a short distance, and the heel did not drag. She looked up and caught me watching, and she said, "I fixed it." I said, "I see that." She said, "I was going to let you, but I was awake at 2 in the morning, and I figured it out." I said, "Good." She said, "You're smiling." I said, "Am I?" She said, "You do that. When you think I've done something well, you think you're keeping it off your face, but you're not." I said, "You pay a lot of attention to my face." She said, "I do. I think it's worth paying attention to." And she went back to camp, and I stood there for a moment in the morning sun thinking about what she had said. Worth paying attention to. My face. This face that I have carried for 53 years through everything it has been through. The scar under my left eye from a knife fight I was too young to be in. The lines that wind left there and grief and time. This face that I had stopped thinking of as anything in particular. Just the face I saw in water when I looked. She paid attention to it. She thought it worth the attention. I stood there a little longer than I needed to. I will tell you something about the year that followed, and then I will leave the rest of it where it belongs, which is in the living of it. We were not always easy. She was stubborn in a way that did not announce itself. It was the quiet kind, the kind that just keeps doing the thing it had decided to do, and when I was also being the quiet kind, we could be very stuck. But we knew how to come back from it. She would make coffee and I would sit down and we would start somewhere different and work our way back. We learned each other the way two people do when they are being honest and paying attention. She wrote letters. She wrote a lot of letters to people I never met, people from her teaching years, a woman in Ohio she'd gone to school with, a cousin somewhere east. I would watch her sometimes at the writing, her whole self concentrated into the pen, and I thought, she was always this much of a person. All these years and no one was watching. I was watching now. In the second spring, when the late winter mud came back, she said to me one morning at the fire, "You know what I keep thinking about?" I said, "What?" She said, "This time 2 years ago I was walking through the dark, and I didn't know where I was going. I was walking toward a river that was half a mile east of where I thought it was, and I was carrying everything I owned, and I was very tired." I said, "I remember." She said, "And then there was a fire." I said, "There was a fire." She said, "And you said sit down." I said, "You looked cold." She said, "I was." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to say something and I want you to not make it small." I said, "All right." She turned toward me. She had her cup in both hands and the morning light was on her face, and she looked at me the way she did that had not changed at all in 2 years, that direct way, that seeing you way, and she said, "Nobody in my life has ever looked out for me. Nobody has ever said, "You here, sit by the fire, eat half a biscuit, sleep where it's warm." Nobody has ever. She stopped and steadied herself. She said, "You gave me a day. You gave me a birthday. You looked at me and said you want me to stay, and then you told me all the reasons I might not want to, and you let me choose. Nobody has ever done that. Nobody has ever let me choose and then honored the choosing." She said, "I want you to know that I see what that is, what it takes to do that. I see the kind of man that is, and I want you to know I see it." I held that. I held the whole weight of it. 53 years of doing what needed doing and being what was needed and carrying what no one else would carry, and then this woman at my fire, 2 years in, looking at me and telling me she saw it. Not the chief, not the leader, the man. I said, "Clara." She said, "Don't make it small." I said, "I'm not making it small." I said, "I hear you." She nodded. She looked back at the fire. Then she leaned against my arm and I put my arm around her, and the mud of late winter was everywhere, exactly as inconvenient as it had always been, and the camp was waking up around us, the sounds of a morning beginning, and I sat there with a woman who had chosen me and who saw me and who had never once been given the thing I had given her until I gave it, and I thought, well, this is what it is to be somewhere. This is what it is to arrive. She told me the next year that she had decided her birthday was the 15th of February, not because she knew it was, but because it was the day she had walked into the firelight and I had said sit down. Because that was, she said, the day she was properly born into a life that felt like hers. I didn't argue with her. She had waited 30-some years to pick one. She could put it wherever she liked. Every year after that, on the 15th of February, I sat down with her at the fire. Just the two of us most years. I would say in my language first, "You came on this day. You are here. You are seen." And she would look at me with that look I cannot find the word for, and she would put her hand on mine. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was, in the end, everything. I am an old man now. I was old when I met her, and I have kept going older, which is either a thing to be grateful for or a thing to be philosophical about. And some days I am one and some days the other. I have been a chief and a husband twice and a father and a grandfather and a lot of other things, and I have been known for various things by various people. What I know is this: she walks beside me. She walks beside me still. Her boot doesn't drag anymore. She has fixed it so many times she's practically built a new boot from the inside. She is older and so am I, and the lines on her face are the lines a person gets who has lived out in the wind and the sun and who has laughed a fair amount after years of not knowing how. She looks at me and I know, because I have learned to read her the way I read the land, that she is still seeing me. This man, this specific one, still worth the looking. 53 years old, and I thought that part of my life was done. It was just waiting for a woman to walk out of the dark.